We are in the book of John. We left off at chapter 13 last week. We finished up chapter 12. Let me find this. Somebody had asked me about this. Somebody was asking about the different periods into which we divided the book. Not original with me, but I like these divisions. Of course, you have the first 18 verses or so of the book will be kind of considered a prologue. Then we said chapter 1, verse 19 through the end of chapter 4, which is verse 54, is called the period of consideration. Chapters 5 and 6 will be 5:1 through 6, verse 71. That's the period of controversy. Chapter 7, verse 1 through 11:53 is the period of conflict. And then is the period of crisis, which is 11:54, chapter 11, verse 54, through chapter 12, verse 36. And really, it's actually in the middle of verse 36. There's a statement that kind of ends that period and then begins the next period, which is the period of conference. This is where we are right now. And that's chapter 12, verse 36 through 17:26, which is through the end of 17. And then we will, when we get to chapter 18, verse 1, to basically the end of the book, is the period of consummation. And technically that would be 18:1 through 20, verse 31. And then the last chapter of the book, most people kind of consider that sort of like an epilogue, wrapping up the book. But those are those main periods: consideration, controversy, conflict, crisis, conference, and consummation. And as I mentioned, we are right now in this period of conference where it's a lot of sometimes and it's not emphasized as much in the book of John, but there's conference going on among the Jewish leaders, plotting against Jesus, how they're going to take him. Even Judas ends up kind of in a type of conference with the Jewish leaders. He's making deals. How much will you give me and I'll betray him to you? But the emphasis in the book of John seems to be on the conference Jesus has with his disciples in this period that'll go really through, I guess in some ways it goes through the end of 16, because chapter 17 is his prayer to the Father. But there's this period of prolonged time that he spends with his disciples, sort of, I guess we might even call it a farewell address. So, chapter 13. Before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. That's a statement in and of itself. He loved them to the very end, talking about the end of his work, the end of his life here. Obviously not the end of his existence, but the idea of, sometimes he'll say, I've finished the work. Well, he loved them completely right up to the very end of his work here on earth. Supper being ended, the devil, having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, again, without getting into a big prolonged discussion of Calvinism, we know this is not anything that's saying Judas didn't have a choice in the matter, but it's the idea of the influence of Satan that is partially what is leading him toward this. But he had free will in the matter, of course. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and he was come from God and went to God. He knew he would come from God, and he knew he was going back to God after all these events surrounding the crucifixion. So he rises from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. And after that he poured water in a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then comes he to Simon Peter. Simon says, Lord, you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not, but thou shalt know hereafter. Of course, Peter says, you'll never wash my feet. And Jesus says, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And then Jesus says, verse 10, he that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, therefore you're not all clean. So then he's going to make the application here in just a moment, verse 12. So after he had washed their feet and taken his garments and was set down again, he said unto them, know you what I have done to you? So Jesus, you know, when you think about Leonardo, is it Da Vinci, right, that painted the Last Supper? Did I get that right? Okay. I'm not good on art, so I was making sure I had the right artist there. But he paints this Last Supper painting, and it's one of those famous paintings, but, you know, he really just totally missed it. He paints it, and number one, they're all like, you know, white European men, which is way off because these would be Middle Eastern people. They would be very dark-skinned, but he also paints a table and chairs, and that's just not how they typically ate in Palestine. In fact, a lot of this makes a whole lot more sense when you realize how they ate. They would eat in a reclined type position. And so you would actually, you know, you would lean on or lie down on your left side, and you might prop on your elbow, or you just kind of, but you're leaned over on your left side, and that leaves your right hand free. You can reach for bread, you can reach for, you know, whatever's on the table. So keep that in mind through this account. They're not sitting at a table. They're reclined is how the most people describe it when you're reading commentaries and things like that. But you'd be kind of lying on your side, and that's how they typically ate. So Jesus arises from supper, and whose house are they in? Is it Jesus' house? Not his house, right? He didn't own a house. Peter's? We don't know, right? I'm not trying to trick you. We don't know. But here's my point with that. In the Middle Eastern climate, obviously it's hot, it's dusty. They wore sandals, and sandals would protect you from stepping on, you know, sharp rocks and things like that. But they don't protect you from what? Dust, dirt. And so, you know, feet in that climate and wearing open sandals, it's not pleasant to get down and wash somebody's feet. And not only that, they're in this borrowed house. Whose job is it? The homeowner typically would handle this. We don't know where the owner of this house is. He's not there. I've often wondered about that after Jesus is risen from the dead and he's glorified, and especially if this fellow lives until the day of Pentecost and the church is established and now the gospel begins spreading and people are saying, hey, I bet that was neat when Jesus came to your house for the Last Supper, right? Well, actually, I wasn't home. I don't know. The Bible doesn't really give us any detail why he wasn't there or what was going on with that. But the homeowner wasn't there. So if you were having guests over, you would be the person when your guests come. It's an act of hospitality. You would invite them in. You would wash their feet. Or if you had some means, you would have your servant do it. And sometimes it may even be someone else in the family. Maybe you're the dad and you've got a child, so your child's going to go and wash. But the point is, that's the host's responsibility, and it's an act of hospitality, and hospitality was huge in that culture. You didn't not show hospitality. In fact, on one occasion in Luke 7, Jesus is going to have this fellow named Simon. It's not Simon Peter. It just happens to be named Simon, a common name. But he's a Pharisee, and he invites Jesus over for a meal. And this woman is there, and Simon says in his heart, if he were a prophet, he would know what manner of woman this is, because she is a sinner. And Jesus points out to him, first he says, Simon, I have something to say. And Simon says, well, say on. And he says, you didn't wash my feet. You didn't anoint me. And yet this woman has ceased not to anoint my feet and to anoint my head and wipe my feet with her tears and the hair of her head. She's showing me more hospitality than you have, Simon, and you're the host. And that really called him out, on top of the fact that he was being very, hypercritical. And Jesus goes on and tells the parable about the different debts. But as host, that was your job. But there is no host. So picture a scene in which these men are all standing around with their nasty feet, dirty, and they're kind of, maybe at first before supper, kind of going, who's gonna wash feet? And whatever, I guess nobody is. We'll just, lie down here to eat with nasty feet and don't think too much about it. And so they eat that meal, and then when supper's over, Jesus gets up, and he doesn't make a big deal about it. He just girds himself with a towel, and he grabs a basin of water, and he begins to come around and start to wash feet. He takes the job of a servant. He didn't look at them as Lord and Master and say, fellas, who's going to handle washing the feet? I'm not going to do it. I'm the leader here. He is the one who takes the lead, and he begins to wash their feet. This is one of those accounts that every time you read it, it just, perhaps they don't understand it yet. Perhaps at first they're just blown away. What is going on? He is washing our feet. They don't understand many things at this point, but they understand he's not just any old person. They get that. So he gets up and he washes their feet. There are a lot of things we could talk about here from service. In fact, I have a lot in my notes, and I'm just kind of picking and choosing here because I don't want to just spend too much time on it because I want to move on. But Jesus does this. He does this without partiality. I think that's another thing that we need to remember is as far as this goes. Do you know who else was there to have his feet washed? Judas. Jesus doesn't come to Judas and say, not you. I know what you're about to do, and you're not getting your feet washed. He serves them without any kind of partiality. He does this with determination. He comes to Peter, and Peter's saying, no, not me. The Lord of heaven and earth is not going to wash my feet. But Jesus says, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have any part with me. And of course, impetuous Peter, he just, well, not my feet only, but everything. And Jesus says, just the feet, because he's teaching a lesson here. By the way, don't miss, there's another lesson here that I think we need to learn. Even for those of us, if we may find ourselves in a situation where we're willing to go and serve others, and we look for ways to help others and serve others, but there's also something here that Jesus is teaching is sometimes it's okay to be served. We don't need to be looking for chances, well, what can everybody do for me? But one of the things that if we all have a servant mentality, then when we serve one another, if I try to serve you and you allow me to do that, then you've not only given me an opportunity to serve in the kingdom, you've helped. If that's a servant mentality, then you've helped fulfill my joy by giving me the opportunity. In fact, at the meal we had at the museum, that I don't remember exactly the wording of it, but that was what the host would traditionally say. They tell us in a meal in Palestinian area, they would say something to the effect of, as they hand out each, whether it's bread or meat or whatever, as they're handing something for the guests to take something from and pass it around, they would say something to the effect of, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to serve you. And so there's a blessing in being able to serve, but you can't serve if nobody allows you to serve. Sometimes people say, oh, no, you're not going to do that for me. Well, sometimes we all have an occasion where we need, or may not even necessarily need the service, but somebody wants to serve. And so there's a lesson in that as well. Tim, you were going to say something.
The end of verse 2 says Judas Iscariot, Simon's son. Is this Simon Peter's son or a different Simon?
This would just be a different Simon because he's a peer of Simon Peter, so wouldn't be any, pretty common name in that time. So just like the guy in Luke 7, no relation. I don't know how many Simons are mentioned in the New Testament, but there's quite a few. So yeah, different person.
The reason that I had asked that is because it seems that the focus is there's a group of individuals together. And that's what is confusing about that, because it's honing in, and one of them there is Simon,
Mm-hmm.
one of them there is Judas. But once again, just
Yeah, it seems to be just an observation. And of course, there's two Judases. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but there are two apostles named Judas. And so a lot of times they'll distinguish them with, in fact, it's in this chapter right around 28-ish. Anyway, it's later on when they're asking Jesus questions, and it'll say something about Judas, not Iscariot. I don't know, but we'll get to it in just a minute. It drives me crazy when I know I've just read something and then I can't find it. But, yes, sir.
dealing with the underlying problem that some of the disciples or his apostles had amongst themselves. And so who's going to sit on the right? Who's going to sit on the left?
Look at Luke 22 for me, please, Robert. I wrote the verse down. 24. Luke 22:24. And just read that if you would, please, when you get there. This is right here in that same context, Luke's account of it.
Verse 24.
Yes, sir.
And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest.
This is in the context of that Last Supper and the washing of the disciples' feet. So yeah, it's also right involved in all this is their bickering over who's going to be the greatest. And can you almost just see the disciples looking at each other as they come in and they start to take their positions at the table, reclining at the table, saying, you gonna wash everybody's feet? I'm not washing people's feet. Are you kidding? That's not my job. And that's the mentality that sometimes, whether in the church or in the workplace, sometimes people have, even in the home sometimes. Not my job. And sometimes even people, when I worked at Blue Cross, that was, you hear people say this all the time, that's not in my job description. Well, something may not be in your job description, but it is an opportunity to serve others, and you can step up. Now, sometimes you can encroach upon somewhere where you don't have authority. I understand that, but I could just imagine these apostles looking around at each other like, who's going to do this? Who's going to do this task that no one wants to do? And so it absolutely goes undone. And at the end of supper, it's almost like Jesus was waiting until the end of supper just to give them a chance to see that no one stepped up to the plate and did this.
A good supervisor or leader leads by example. And being that Jesus left us an example for us to follow, there's a lesson that he was trying to teach.
And that's it. And he comes in verse 13, he says, at the end of 12, know you what I've done to you. You call me master and Lord and say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. As Robert said, a good leader leads by example. A good leader is not just pointing the way and barking out orders. I read a story one time that this fella came upon. It was in colonial times, and he came upon these soldiers. he even hoeing this big, massive tree had fallen across the road, and there's one fellow on horseback, and these two soldiers are just striving with everything they got to move this log, and it's not moving. And the fellow on horseback is saying, "Come on, lift it, try harder." And he's just barking out orders. Well, the fellow that had come upon this scene, he dismounts, gets down there, and he says, "Come on, boys, let's give it one good try." Well, they finally get it to move and kind of roll it out of the way where people can ride along the road. And he said, how come you didn't help? And he says, "Man, are you kidding? I'm a colonel," or whatever his rank was. He said, "It's not my job." And the fellow turned around as he was getting ready to leave, and he says, "Well, I guess next time you need help, you can ask the commander-in-chief." It was George Washington. He was the one that got down and helped the men move the burden. The other fellow was just, barking out orders, and that's beneath me. I'm not going to dismount from my horse and go help those guys do the dirty work. But a true leader, a good leader, leads by example. And Jesus does that here. And he says, by the way, verse 15, he says, "I've given you an example." He doesn't say, "I've given you a new act of worship, and I want you to do this, for all time, to get down and wash each other's feet." That's not the point here. And if we start, trying to have foot washings and things like that as part of worship, we've completely missed the point of what Jesus is trying to teach us here. What he's trying to teach is service. Not a single person is above getting down on your hands and knees, getting dirty, and serving someone else. Because the Lord of heaven and earth came down to this world. He got down on his hands and knees, and he washed stinking, nasty, dusty, dirty feet. And if he can do that, you tell me what I'm above doing. I mean, if ever there was a person that was above it, it's him. That's the lesson here. Not to say, well, it's foot washing Sunday, so I got to make sure my feet are nice and clean, and I'm going to take off my foot and someone's going to wash one foot. Come on. That's ridiculous in itself. He didn't just go wash one foot that was already clean. The point is, they were nasty. And it's service. It's all about service. And he's teaching them, as Robert pointed out, they're bickering about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. And again, going back to our lesson from the intertestamental period, keep in mind one of these apostles is a zealot, so you can almost hear him saying, well, I ought to be, because the zealots, we don't compromise like you tax collectors, you turncoats that work for the Roman government. We don't do any of that, and so we should have the better spot in the kingdom because, we are the purists. And then, different ones arguing different reasons why they ought to be best or highest or most prominent in the kingdom. And Jesus just proceeds to get up and put on a towel and to wash their feet. Again, it's just one of those amazing things that you read about, and every time you do, it just impresses upon us the importance of having a servant's mentality, a servant's heart. There was somebody, I can't remember who it was, that I used to know, that every time you do something, this person would mention their mother. So that was their favorite expression of their mother. Sometimes a child would agree to do something for another child at home, or Johnny, can you take out the trash? And then here comes brother or sister and says, you know what, I'll do it for them. And the mom would always say, you got the heart of a servant, and really, brag on the kids for that. And that's something that more people need, is the heart of a servant. We live in a world that so often wants to be served. And there's a time when that's okay. It's not wrong to be served. It's wrong to want and to expect to be served. It's wrong not to have an attitude of, how can I serve others? So that's the lesson here, and it's just we could spend a lot more time on it if we had it. But let's go on. He points out to them that the servant's not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. In other words, if I'm not too good to get down and wash feet, neither are you. That's what he's saying there. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. Now he says, I speak not of you all, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it come, that when it has come to pass, you may believe that I am. Notice the word he there is in italics. He says that you may believe that I am. Again, that we've pointed out before, God is the great I am. He's God in the flesh. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. Now when Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. So now it's going to kind of shift and talk about the events going on here with the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Oh, I'm about to forget one thing that I wanted to mention before we move on from Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Let's turn to 1 Peter. I don't know how we could doubt that Peter is recalling what happened in John 13 when he writes this in 1 Peter 5. I knew I was forgetting something. Somebody read 1 Peter 5, verse 5, please.
Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
All right, Peter says, be clothed with humility. I don't remember the exact word. It's something like ekombomon, something like that. But it's a Greek word that literally is reference to girding oneself with a slave's towel for something such as getting down and washing guests' feet for your master, the host of some kind of get-together. I don't think there can be any question that Peter, as he writes that, is thinking back to that evening when Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, and he says, you all, Christians, be clothed with humility. Clothe yourselves with humility. Put it on as a garment. Wear it and be that way. It's an attitude, it's a mindset. Yes, sir?
Curiosity question, which denomination is it that practices feet washing on a regular basis?
I don't know. I think there are multiple groups who practice some form of foot washing as a I guess an act of worship. But it's typically, I think a lot of times it's like once a month or something like that. But it's a shame that somebody took that and tried to turn into an act of worship, because again, you completely missed the point that Jesus is saying, serve, not once a month, not once a week, but it's a mindset of how can I serve others instead of how can I be served. So I want to mention that for 1 Peter 5. I knew I was forgetting that, but I love that when Peter says, be clothed with humility. Just as Jesus clothed himself with that servant's towel and began to do a servant's task, we need to be clothed with humility. But in verse 21, he draws the application for the disciples here. Now he's going to move and begin talking about his betrayer. And he says John says that Jesus was troubled in spirit. This is the same word that's used in other passages. We noticed it in John 11. Jesus saw her weeping. The Jews came with her weeping. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. John 12, Jesus says, my soul is troubled. So he knew what was going to take place, but that didn't take away the hurt of it. That didn't take away the dread. It's not just because you know what's going to happen doesn't mean you're looking forward to it. Just because you know I'm going to rise from the dead the third day doesn't mean you're looking forward to going through all this. He had emotions. He was 100% human as well as 100% God. And so he says his soul is troubled. Now, 22 through 30, it kind of takes a harmony of the gospel accounts to get the entire story here. Because in John's account here, he says, one of you shall betray me. The disciples are looking around. You can almost picture a very awkward silence here, where they're all looking at each other and their eyes moves from person to person, looking like at each one of them looking at each other like, is it you? He just said somebody's going to betray him. Is it you? And almost like, you could even see maybe some accusing looks at one another like, I've been seeing you. You talking about being greatest in the kingdom. Maybe it's going to be you. But he they look around at each other. Then, verse 23, there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. This is John's way of referring to himself, the disciple Jesus loved. He was one of the, sometimes we call them the inner three, the best friends of Jesus, we might say, Peter, James, and John. So this is a reference to John. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. This tells us a couple of things about John. We already knew he was part of that inner circle, but he's also sitting right next to Jesus, or not sitting, again, reclined. It's just habit to say sitting, but bear in mind if I say that we're talking about this reclining type position. And so, just kind of lean back is the idea. It's sort of a figure of speech and expression, leaning on Jesus' bosom. And he sort of leans back, and you can see Peter probably kind of across the table. And Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. So they're all looking around, and you can sort of see, you almost picture Peter saying, Psst, John, ask him. And so John does. And so, they want to know, who's he talking about? And so John, this is a private conversation that's going on. John says, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. J.W. McGarvey points out in his commentary that, I just lost my spot, the dipping bowls, a lot of times they would have vinegar or oil or something like that, and many times multiple dipping bowls, but they were shared by just a small few. You would have a couple of guys using the same bowl, and then, over here you'd have the next 2 or 3 guys, they would have a bowl, and they could share that. So Jesus is apparently sitting very near Judas as well. We don't know the exact order of all the disciples at this meal, but we know something about it because John obviously was sitting right next to Jesus. Judas was at least in pretty close proximity, probably the other side of Jesus would seem to be logical, because it'd be hard for more than 2, possibly 3 people to share that same dipping bowl. And for, if it was Jesus and then John next to him and then over here Judas, it's not as likely that they're dipping in the same bowl there. But anyway, so putting this together with Matthew's account, Matthew just says, Jesus saying that he that dips his hand with me in the dish. We know this was said to John. We'll see that in just a moment. We'll see why we say that. Again, he's not saying this openly. He's saying this to John in a private kind of aside, which would, again, make sense. If John's on this side of Jesus and Judas is on the other, it's easier for them to talk privately, and Judas doesn't hear that conversation. In Matthew's account, he also seems to address Judas privately, because Judas says, Lord, is it I? And Jesus says what? In the King James, it has Jesus saying, thou hast said, or what does the New King James have? It is as you say, something like that. But that would be addressed to Judas privately. Again, because the other disciples don't know what's going on here. And Mark records they're all saying, Lord, is it I? Is it I? You could just almost see a bombardment of questions. Am I the one? Are you saying I'm going to betray you? And in the midst of all that, apparently Judas kind of leans over and says, is it I? And Jesus, his response is just simply, thou hast said. It's almost as if he's saying, don't play dumb with me. He's not trying to be rude, but just saying, you know what you've done, Judas. And in fact, John records Jesus adds something to that and says what? That thou doest, do quickly. And, people sometimes read that and they say, why would Jesus say that? Sometimes, we even say maybe a difficult situation or whatever, and we may say, you know what, just get it over with. Go ahead. And it's not permission. It's not Jesus is excited about it, but he's just saying, go on and do it. And of course, he knows this is all fulfilling God's ultimate plan, that Jesus should be offered for the sins of mankind. And so in that sense, he's saying, Go ahead. You've made this covenant. Go ahead.
On Judas's side, there's two things. He carried the bag, so he was kind of their treasurer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it said that he was a thief.
Yes.
But on the other side, in some way, is there anything to point toward he was going to try to stop Jesus from doing what Jesus said he had come to do?
I don't know. I don't know that there is, because the only indication is that he made a covenant with the leaders for money. So it seemed to be all about money for him. And in fact, when he's hit with the remorse, instead of repenting and making it right, he comes and he wants to give the money back. And they say, we can't, we don't want that. That's the price of blood. Which again is one of those great ironies of Scripture. You know, they just crucified or had the Son of God crucified, but they're worried about, we can't defile the temple with that money. But yeah, I don't see any indication that this is really anything other than, I've heard that theory from some people before, but I don't know what I would base that on if I were going to say he's trying to stop Jesus from the mission that he came to fulfill. I don't know that they even fully understand his mission still at this point. But it seems to be all about money with Judas. And Luke, by the way, Luke's account just says, Jesus just says the hand of his betrayers with him on the table. 26, Jesus answered, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. Again, that's spoken privately to John. When he dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. So he says, it's the one I'm going to give when I sop the bread, the one I give it to. So he does that, he gives it to Judas. So now John knows. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Again, it's not against his will, it's because he allowed such, having made this choice. Then said Jesus unto him, that thou doest do quickly. Now no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. This is why I say you got to put the gospel accounts together to get the full story. No man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. Jesus says, what you do quickly. And so some of them think, because Judas had the bag, verse 29, that Jesus says, what you do quickly. In other words, go buy the things we need for the feast quickly. Or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. So now, when Judas leaves, verse 31 begins a section that will go all the way through chapter 16. This is Jesus' private conference with his apostles, minus Judas, of course, who's gone out to betray him. But at this point, he's going to, it's sort of well, especially beginning at chapter 14, it's going to be a farewell address. And then, of course, his prayer to the Father in chapter 17. This is it. Final instructions before his death. 7 times he's going to say, these things have I spoken unto you. That's a key phrase in this section. He's going to remind them, these things have I spoken unto you. They don't always remember it. They will when they receive the Holy Spirit, this immersion in the Holy Spirit. But he's reminding them that I prepared you for this day. It's kind of like a coach saying to his players, boys, we practiced this. This is what we worked for. This is what we prepared for. Now just do what you've been taught. As parents, maybe you're dropping that child off at college or sending them away from home for the first time, and you say, now we've talked about this and we've talked about that, and you know what you've got to do. Jesus says, these things have I spoken unto you. I've prepared you for this. They're going to feel very unprepared. But he says, I have prepared you for this. And then he tells them later on, we'll come to that, when the Spirit has come, he's going to make sure you remember every single thing. You don't have to worry about, oh no, I forgot that. What did he say about that? God's going to take care of all that. And so there are 3 sections here of this conference: preparation, relationships, and revelation. Look at what he says. I don't want to get through chapter 13 before we run out of time. Now is the Son of Man glorified, 31, and God is glorified in him. It's called futuristic present tense in the Greek. In other words, this is how definite it is that it's going to happen. He speaks of it. It's already happened. It's definite. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. It's that certain. And so he begins preparing them. The first order of business begins in verse 33. The departure is coming. They had to remain unified if they're going to be able to win the world for Christ and take the gospel to the world. Their jealousies, their desires for preeminence had to go away. And so he says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love one to another. It's not a new thing to say love your neighbor or love your brethren. It's the extent of love. He says, as I have loved you. That takes it to a whole other level, doesn't it? And he says, this is how people are going to know you're my disciples. And for centuries after, that's going to prove to be the case. Notice, Peter says, Jesus tells him, whither I go, you can't follow me now, but you'll follow me afterward. Peter says, why can I not follow you? I'll lay down my life for thee. His assessment of himself was a little bit ambitious, wasn't it? Because Jesus says, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And so chapter 14, Lord willing, will begin next week, and we'll see Jesus begins this first part of the farewell address to tell them, I've prepared you for this. Get ready. Strengthen yourself, because I'm going away. Thank y'all very much for the comments and for your attention, and we'll have a short break before our worship period begins. Thank you.